Namaskar. Good afternoon. It is indeed an honor to chair this session where Mrs. Sathe is present. I had the great privilege of serving with Ambassador Sri Ram Sathe, who was my distinguished senior colleague, Foreign Secretary of India. I was a young officer at that time, and I worked with him for a number of years. It is also a very pleasant coincidence for me that currently I hold Ram Sathe Chair for International Relations at the Symbiosis International University. So it's a double pleasure to be here this afternoon where this memorial lecture for Sri Ram Sathe is being conducted. I must thank at the outset Sri Pradeep Wagh, the president of the Shivajinagar Rotary Club, who I think more than a year and a half first came to me. And I was quite amazed because, as we all know, in India we never plan so much in advance. In Delhi, several meetings and conferences are held at the notice of a few weeks, if not few days. And therefore, when he started talking of February 17, it appeared to me it was way, way distant. But anyway, as you plan well, the date finally comes, and here we are. I'm also grateful to Sri Vishwanath Kararji for being host to us here and for having such wonderful interaction. The talks given by Mr. Paul Netzel, the chairman of the Rotary Foundation, and Mr. Vishwanath Kararji, very instructive and informative. We have all known that Rotary is an international organization, but Rotary is in fact one of the leading and one of the most respected NGOs in the world, which has been functioning for nearly, 90 years now. And what Mr. Netzel told us, from that, it was also very revealing that several inputs which Rotary gave in the form of discussions or suggestions to even the founders of the UN Charter in 1945, or the UNESCO, or the Human Rights Commission Declaration in 1948. I think that kind of contribution which the Rotary started making, perhaps indirectly, is a contribution they have been making to peace all along. And therefore, it is indeed, I think, very imaginative on part of Rotary Club Shivajinagar and the District Governor Prashant Deshmukh to come up with this theme, International Peace and Symposium for International Understanding and Peace. Now, peace is a word with which nobody has a quarrel. Every government has peace as its main objective, its agenda. All of us also seek peace in our lives. But peace is also very vulnerable. There are so many pressures on peace. Countries have their own national interests. Their vital interests sometimes do not necessarily advance the cause of peace. So when we talk of peace, and as was discussed in the course of the morning, any human act or any action which leads to welfare or happiness can be construed as peace. So this is a very abstract concept, peace. And therefore, promotion of peace becomes central to the objectives of countries as well as organizations like Rotary. Now, diplomacy, how does that come into this whole business? Diplomacy is in fact a very ancient art. It's an art of negotiation. It is a skill with which one tries to persuade the opponents to get your objectives fulfilled without resort to violence or war. In fact, as they say, when diplomacy fails, war starts. Now, diplomacy is also, in the modern context, a major business between nations. And the nations are relatively, if you see the human history, again a new concept. It's about 500 years old. It was essentially a European concept, is generally understood as the Westphalian 1648 origin and concept. And therefore, several things what we associate with our nationhood, the welfare of a country, the defense of a country, all get related to that concept of nationhood. And in that comes the whole element of geopolitics. Diplomacy becomes the principal instrument for foreign policy of a country. And foreign policy, as seen in the wider context, includes your political interests, your security, economic advance, cultural strength, commercial possibilities, and so on. So how diplomacy helps to promote your national interests, your country's interests, your country's foreign policy. The global order has been so far based, as I said, on the concept of nation states, where aspects such as sovereignty, territorial integrity, defense, non-interference in internal affairs, national security, all these concepts are important. Now, in this, again, how to fit in peace? Because when there are disputes between two countries, peace gets endangered. When you are talking of your interests, say commercial or economic interests, which clash with somebody else's, again, peace is under threat. So traditional and classical diplomacy, which meets the needs or aspirations of nation states through various forms. And diplomacy, therefore, gets various forms as we are now understand. We often talk of track 2 diplomacy. There was a reference made to track 2 diplomacy. That means diplomacy not through the government functionaries, government agents, or diplomatic agents, the foreign offices of two countries, but at the private level, say people-to-people diplomacy. When you talk of a track and a half, 1.5 diplomacy, means it is not entirely government, yet it is not entirely people-to-people. You have diplomacy to secure your borders, your territorial integrity, which becomes purely political diplomacy related to the defense of the country. Then you have economic diplomacy and commercial diplomacy. In today's world, a country is not strong unless it is economically strong. And therefore, economic diplomacy nowadays takes priority on several other political issues as well. Commercial diplomacy also acquires considerable importance because it is the trade today which really takes precedence over a number of things. And how trade diplomacy is conducted, again, becomes very important. We talk of culture diplomacy. India can extend, there was a reference made in the morning that India can lead the world in terms of its spiritual power, or can be a guru to the other countries, etc. So that is cultural diplomacy, since we have very strong cultural attributes which have been generally acceptable to a number of countries in the world. Often a reference is made to soft power. That is a new word for cultural diplomacy. And India's soft power, be it in the form of yoga, or it is Bollywood, or Indian cuisine, or now literature of Indian authors, all that can come under the ambit of cultural diplomacy. There is also science and technology diplomacy. India has of late shown considerable expertise and strength in space technology, which India could perhaps share. A few days ago, we sent in space 108 satellites. So that is an area in which diplomacy can also be advanced. And finally, diplomacy today is not only bilateral between two countries, in geopolitics, a new dimension has come that is in the form of regional diplomacy. Countries within a region, for example, countries within Europe, they interact to form European Union, or countries in Southeast Asia forming ASEAN. In South Asia, we have SAARC. So there's regional diplomacy, and then of course, multilateral diplomacy in the shape of United Nations. So there are number of forms under which diplomacy can be evolved and can be at play. And there are today negotiations taking place on global commons such as climate, or the ocean, or the space, or the cyber security. Now all these are forms of diplomacy. Now whether all these are really aimed at securing, obtaining peace, and I think that is the theme of our symposium. Now how we can do that? You see, often we hear nowadays that the world is coming closer, world is becoming one. Technology has brought us now at an instant delay. That indeed is very encouraging. I think today's world is far, far different from, say, 50 years. Say, when I joined the service, it was so difficult to travel from one place to another. Getting a message across was so difficult. Today is not the case. But in spite of that, can really one say that the world is coming close? Is the threat to peace less today? Is peace becoming less vulnerable? And there I think one can find it is not entirely so. There are so many factors today which somehow dampens our enthusiasm. You have a very strong wind of nationalism blowing around across several countries, which we thought that with the advent of globalization, say from the early 90s, the world was really coming closer and nationalism was on the wane. That doesn't seem to be the case. You have the vote in England, Brexit, which calls for a separate identity for UK. We are going to have some more now elections in Europe. The recent election and the incoming of the US president also has connotations towards nationalism. You see that in China, to some extent in India. So this is a new phenomenon which is taking place, again, not quite in consonance with the ideas one had already thought. There is today issues like immigration. Now, with globalization, one had expected that there will be free flow of not only capital and technology, but also human skills. But it is not an entirely smooth flow as was hoped under globalization. There is also a trend towards religious fundamentalism and terrorism. In the last 20 years or so, this is raging across the world, which has so alarmingly disturbed peace all around the world. Now, this is again a relatively new phenomenon, and with the emergence of such bodies like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, one wonders how we are going to secure peace and what are the means through which that can be obtained. There are also threats by some powerful states to acquire or to dominate territories in the seas or in lands. So there are a number of such issues which can really bring a question mark about peace, which is so much necessary, particularly for developing countries as well as developed countries. On the economic side also there are issues. You have the issues like protectionism, because the world was moving to a fairly smooth flow of trade for the first few years after the formation of WTO in 1995, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Number of free trade agreements are today being questioned. Some of them have been even dropped, and therefore you will have again a major question about the success of some of these free trade agreements or some of the international organizations dealing with issues like WTO or intellectual property and so on. Well, that does not mean that the picture is so gloomy. I think simultaneously efforts are going on to secure peace. I think this will have to be done both by governments as well as by people-to-people exchanges, by NGOs and so on. We are therefore at a very important and interesting stage in the global geopolitics today. And for that, without losing heart, we'll have to continue to find like-minded countries which are wedded to the ideas of security and peace. A number of agreements have been recently entered into, the agreement on climate change or environment issues, to which our friend Dr. Rajendra Shende, who has the distinction of being one of the Nobel laureates, alluded to. That was a very positive development. There are number of new initiatives which countries are bringing out to get greater cooperation among countries. The announcement of the Sustainable Development Goals as one subject, I think should be of great interest to Rotary everywhere. SDGs, to which again Mr. Shende referred to, were announced in September 2015. This is a new hope for mankind. It's a very, very ambitious program which will really require trillions of dollars of investment. Whether such huge outlays will be available or not is a question. I'm not sure whether such funding will come through or not. But the kind of aims and objectives that the SDGs have set before themselves, the kind of agenda and the record of number of states, including India, for the previous goals, namely the MDGs, suggest and happily suggest that I think the world is on the path towards, at least making full effort towards fulfilling those goals. As an NGO like Rotary, I think if Rotary can concentrate even on 2 or 3 such goals out of 17, their contribution to the world at large can be really enormous. I do hope that such suggestions will come forward, and the Rotarians, as they are continuously engaged with such noble work as they do, will look at these things also positively. As Mr. Paul Netzel said, we should look forward to positive peace. I like this phrase very much. I think peace should be also seen as positive peace. There are dangers to peace, but there are also enough grounds for optimism for peace. Thank you.